Hi, I'm John Reardon. I have been working with leaders and teams for over 30 years to help you expand your capacity to get great results. In times of crisis, organizations have got to quickly assess your mission and redefine your priorities. You've got to stay in touch with your staff and your stakeholders, and you've got to make sure you have the tools you need to get the job done. The 3 Keys in a Crisis model is a diagnostic tool that'll help you and your team assess your mission priorities, define critical communications, and identify the tools you need in order to execute effectively. In this video, I'm going to discuss each element of the 3 Keys model with a group of clients and colleagues on a video conference call. We're going to look at each element and discuss the implications of the model for their organizations. As we're doing that, it'll give you the opportunity to think through how this model applies to you and your organization. Well, thanks everybody for participating. Appreciate your time and joining in, and looking forward to walking through the model with you. We're going to be taking a look at the 3 keys in a crisis model, which I hope will be useful to you individually and with your teams and organizations and or other teams and organizations that you work with. Feel free to ask questions at any point. I'll be giving a quick overview, and then we'll go into each aspect of the model and then do a wrap-up at the back end. You have the workbook handy, either printed or on the screen nearby. The intent is to go through this sufficiently to give you some ideas, maybe some questions, some possibilities to apply this. And then, like I said, feel free to ask questions and we'll address some specifics and possibilities of how this might apply in a variety of organizations in different sectors. So as you can see, the 3 keys, the idea of the Venn diagram is that it really is about finding the sweet spot where all of these meet effectively, because each of these elements affects the others. So you look at the 3 core questions, right? The mission. What's our mission in this particular situation? And does the situation impact our mission? And there's several options for the degree of impact that the crisis and the current upheaval might be having when it comes to the mission of the organization. The second is, in terms of communication, how are we going to stay connected? Teams are moving to virtual operations, distributed operations, disruption of typical processes, and that sort of stuff. And so how do we stay connected with our own organization, and how do we stay connected with our stakeholders? And then the third element is the tools, because we've got to have the tools to do the job, to carry out the mission, and to stay connected. And if we don't have certain tools, then there's only certain things we can do. The tools themselves may be a limiting factor as to how effectively we can carry out our priorities. And so you can see the need to iterate these conversations in order to hone in on that sweet spot. What can we accomplish in terms of priorities, and what are the tools that we need to get the job done? So let's take a look at the model. So right on the cover page, and you can see I just included one point there at the upper section of the page to first, let's ensure that everyone's okay. And so before you launch into the business conversation and getting into these elements, just make sure you've had an opportunity to pause and check in with folks. Right? This situation is disrupting people's lives in all kinds of ways, and before you rush into the business discussion, take a second, or more than a second, take a few minutes and pause and make sure you've checked in with folks. See if they're okay physically, see if they're okay economically, just how they're doing, and if they're open to sharing that, if that's helpful to them. If they're ready to get down to business, then great, go for it. So this idea of finding the sweet spot, and you can see the model based in the Venn diagram. So let's turn to page 2. The mission, and you see the questions on the page. What is our mission in this specific situation? Has our mission changed? Has it not changed? Has it changed in terms of how we carry out our mission? To what degree? A little bit, a lot, and then that will lead us to the other questions about how we communicate that and with what tools. So there's 3 options in the change degrees. Option A is no change, right? So straight up, keep doing what we're doing because we're doing exactly what is needed right now in this situation. Examples would be healthcare, right? Medical workers, first responders, a lot of public services. This is exactly what's needed, right? There's going to be challenges in terms of communication, in terms of processes being disrupted, but they are on point on mission, right? So they just need to focus in, figure out workarounds where they have disruptions, but continue to get the job done. Option B, some degree of change. Most organizations are going to be somewhere in this category in terms of needing to adjust in some way, small or drastic, not wholesale, but consider how to make the adjustments that are necessary in order to continue, right? So education going online, retail perhaps going online, finding alternative ways to engage customers, transportation services, all kinds of different industries and different sectors. Organizations are having to figure out how do we continue forward, but adjust the way we're delivering, the way we're communicating, connecting with stakeholders, etc. And then option C is complete change. So this would be a business that cannot operate under the current conditions. An organization whose services simply are not necessary for this time period. So I'm working with a client and 50% of the organization is focused on the administrative services, which are absolutely necessary and need to continue as they are in a virtual environment. 50% of the organization is focused on facilities, which are completely shut down, right, and virtually non-operational. So they need a very low percentage of resources on the facilities. Now they have to reallocate or try to reallocate resources to the other side of the house that's getting swamped. So they have to figure out different pieces of their organization are being impacted differently. If you see those questions for action, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So first question, what category describes your organization or various parts of your organization? What adjustments do you need to make and on what timeline, right? With what sense of urgency? And how will you communicate those adjustments to whom and by what means, right? Who needs to be involved in this decision and who needs to know about these decisions? I'd be curious to hear what thoughts this brings to mind, what questions, how you see that applying to your organization or organizations that you work with.
It's been interesting with my work in athletics. I would almost say we're a hybrid between A and C, and the best phrase I would use to describe that is suspended animation. So in some ways, of course, we have some change because of policy and rule of what we're able to do and working remotely from home and only communicating via phone, Zoom, FaceTime, etc. But specifically regarding recruiting, our focus is on evaluation weekends and those contests of players actually playing at a younger level. And those are canceled for the time being, and we don't know when they're going to start back up. So a lot of our work is just stopped and on pause, but everything has to be ready to, when it starts back up, to go right back to where it was. So our mission doesn't change long term, it's just suspended animation right now.
Yeah. Can you reallocate resources to other, either support the organization yourselves in other ways, or simply offer resources to other sectors that are in need?
So I just got off a meeting, and even though we're not directly affected, thinking about how we can get our house in order, if you will, so that we can support other people quicker, and also have a very defined service list, if you will. Like, okay, if you need this, we can do that. I think is very important, but it needs to be said very explicitly. Because some folks are like, well, it doesn't affect me, so they're not even thinking about it. And some things could be, while we have quote unquote downtime, making sure we're showing what value we're adding to the organization at the very least. And then at a higher level, value that we can add to other areas. But even that needs to be said explicitly right now in my scenario.
Yeah. Yep. Excellent.
I'm working with an organization that has a lot of external consultants that do a lot of international travel, and that has obviously come full stop. So it's interesting that home base is actually now having to take on more responsibility for how this consulting is going to be done virtually, whereas much of it was being done face to face. So not only did home base have its original roles, but now they're taking on a many more projects because they're having to figure out how to use cell phone technology to reach the outermost parts of some of these foreign countries that we've been working in.
Yeah.
So not only it's new problems that have arisen, right? So it's not only the old mission, it's new mission.
Yeah, I would add to that. So it's interesting how when we're describing an organization, and does the mission tend to change, or do the characteristics around that mission change?
Yeah.
And I've noticed a lot of the mission is still to protect the public and preserve the public health, but it's also things are sort of shifting like very slowly. It's kind of like turning a battleship, but it's getting to the right resources to the right people at the right time.
Mhm.
And it's a challenge in the sense that you hear a lot of these things about a detail coming and saying, okay, well, we need emergency staff in this one location, but how do you get there to fulfill that mission is a challenge.
Yeah. And then when it comes to various private sector, businesses, obviously across the spectrum, some are right on point and their mission is serving exactly the need right now. Many in the middle, and then quite a number are in that category C where their business is shut down and they've got to figure out a different way to either go into some other business very literally, or at a minimum stay viable in that, as you were saying, Miriam, suspended animation, to stay viable through this period to a time when they could come back online. But in the meantime, what do? Right? And just sitting on resources as opposed to trying to figure out how might we tap into those, use those differently, maybe apply them somewhere else. An events management company that is sitting on millions of dollars worth of the giant tents, all the tables, all the chairs, all the stuff for all the weddings and the big outdoor events, and they're sitting on a warehouse full of all this stuff. Well, what are they going to do with it? They can just sit on it. They figured out that that's what's needed by a lot of healthcare, hospitals and emergency services folks who can use all that stuff, perhaps at a fraction of the cost, but at least they can do something with it, keep people working, keep their business going, so that, and hopefully, in the future, they'll be able to come back online. And so they realize that there's an entire different opportunity to serve a different purpose for this interim. In a moment, you're going to pause the video and have a think about how these 3 action questions apply to you and your organization. First, which category describes your organization? Are you option A, no change, your mission is right on target? Option B, some change to some degree, greater or lesser? Option C, a complete change in mission. Second question, what adjustments do you need to make and on what timeline? And third, how will you communicate those adjustments to whom and by what means? Gather your thoughts, compare your notes with your colleagues, see if any clarity emerges on this mission conversation. And when you're ready, come on back to the video. Well, let's. You can see that conversation for any particular organization could go very deep, or it might be very quick. It really depends on the nature of the organization, but those are some questions they need to address so that they can move to this next piece on page 3. If you turn to page 3, the second element here is based on this conversation about mission. So then, what are our priorities? Right? How does that impact our top priorities right now? Have they changed? Do they stay the same? Right? What can we do? What can we not do? So for example, IT services, there's a firm that used to go on site and deliver the IT services at the client site. Now they're walking the client through the steps virtually and delivering their service, but doing it from a virtual environment. Housing inspections, a colleague of mine who's a builder, the inspectors are not coming to the site to do the inspections, but they are continuing to do them. They're doing them virtually, so the entire process can still move forward. Providing meals, providing basic necessities, organizations that are involved, nonprofits, community organizations that are involved in serving the community. They are finding ways to organize curbside pickups, to continue to serve, but doing it in adherence with the current policies that are in place for the safety and security of everyone. Right? There's some elements of mission that we can carry out. There are some elements of mission that we cannot carry out, right? At least not in the same way. And then there's other elements that we can do if we find a different way to deliver. And then the third piece of that, to whom do we need to communicate? Who do we need to get input from? And who do we need to communicate to when it comes to this conversation about mission and priorities? So when it comes to your staff, it's not just about informing them. Before you make the decisions, you want to make sure you're getting input from your staff. They're the ones out on the front lines. They might have a sense of what's going on out there. You want to be able to gather information from them and make decisions and then communicate and keep them informed. Your stakeholders, right? When you're shifting your priorities, you've got to make sure your stakeholders have that information, that you're staying connected with them, and that they're staying connected with you. You've got to make sure your team and your customers and stakeholders are aware of your shift in priorities. Right? So communication about this starts to become important and then leads to that next element. Now they can get to the next piece. So in a moment you can stop the video and take some time to gather your thoughts with regard to your priorities. Talk with your colleagues and see if you can get some clear definition on what your priorities are right now in the midst of the turmoil and who you need to communicate with so that they can be informed, both your own team as well as your stakeholders. When you're ready, come on back to the video. So if you turn to page 4, that second key around communication. Which information is critical for whom? And in various categories, your core team, your leadership team, whatever that means in the given context, the staff, right, the entirety of the organization, and obviously there could be many levels of that, and then other stakeholders, customers, those outside the organization itself, and again, identifying who those are and how do we communicate effectively to them, and does that need to change under the current circumstance? And what cadence works best, right? Is it a daily update, an hourly update? You know, are we online 24/7 with a particular group? How often do we touch base with the all hands, various sub-teams? What cadence works for them? And then what about those one-on-ones, and how do you stay in touch with the individuals and really let people know that you care about them even while you are working to urgently carry out mission? Any reaction around this just in terms of the content of communication and then this idea of cadence and how you carry it out?
Yeah, this is Ed. So I did notice that. So when you've got these email blasts that keep coming out, and it comes, although in their perspective, it seems like a slow, steady trickle of information. But having like 10 of those at the same time can sort of, from the end user perspective, it's almost like message fatigue. You're not really sure what to look at. You've got keywords saying, "Oh, this seems in like an important communication through the subject line." So those are the kind of things that I kind of wonder about, because once you send out communication and you send it out saying, "Oh, I'm only sending a month," that end user at the other end of it is seeing 10 of those at the same time. So I kind of like that idea of cadence, but just not from an individual perspective, but from like a global perspective if possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Coming out of a Coast Guard background doing the emergencies and the crisis management, there were hourly briefings and daily briefings, depending on what level of leadership. And so I think you're right, John. I think this is to get not only get the cadence, but as Ed is saying, the written communication, it may be helpful to actually have the same categories and actually have the similar information in every message. So somebody doesn't have to read 10 messages. There's a combination message, and they only have to read the latest one. They don't have to go back and read, 4 days of these messages. It's just, so they, in some ways they get longer, but if people are keeping up with the information, it can be quite helpful just to have to look at one at a time. So, anyway, good point, Ed.
Sorry, but with message fatigue, Ed, I like that phrasing. We were just talking about that today regarding recruiting. We have a lot of high school students getting these phone calls all day with nothing to talk about other than the fact that there's a coronavirus going on and we don't know when anything's going to start back up. So we were brainstorming today on how do you become more creative in what you're sending, how you're engaging them, so that you eliminate a lot of that fatigue, or at least make sure that whatever communication we're going to provide is going to be the best or the most interesting or the most intriguing and the most engaging, as opposed to just standard. And then it's been interesting within our staff, organization-wise, how little communication there's been at the lower levels. And I would say, despite some of my engagement, oftentimes I fall into a lower level bucket. And it's like, I've just been hanging out, doing my thing. And then you finally will get a call at some point, and then you get caught up, but you realize that there's been a lot of communication that you haven't been a part of because you're not in a closed office environment where there's 10 of you around. And so you're not catching those walking from one office to the next where they throw you some line of information. So that's been interesting to navigate that personally.
Yep. So again, we could dive into more depth on this, and this is one of the conversations that, of all of them, but this one in particular will need to be reviewed iteratively, because obviously the nature of the information can change minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, and the nature of that change may necessitate using different tools and different means to communicate. And so setting the cadence that's appropriate, and then following that, and then changing it as necessary, right? All right, so you know the drill. In a moment, you can stop the video, gather your thoughts, and talk with your colleagues, see if you can clearly define what is the critical information that you need to communicate, what cadence will work best, and what platform is going to be most effective to communicate with your leadership team, your staff members in the all-hands context, the sub-teams, and those one-on-one conversations, formal and informal, and communicate with your stakeholders and customers. And when you're ready, come on back to the video and we'll move to key number 3. So then how do we communicate, right? So we have this idea of what we want to communicate, and then if you turn with me to page 5, let's talk about the tools. Because we have all this great content to communicate, and we're thinking about carrying out the mission and how we carry that forward. Well, what tools do we have to do so? On page 5, I've outlined, again, oversimplified, but 3 levels of engagement that may need to be considered. But for example, when it comes to what tools do we have and what tools do we need for which purposes? So for project management, the idea of carrying something out in the longer term, from the planning phase to the execution to the accountability, how do we sustain project management in the virtual world, and what are the tools we need to do that? Now, some organizations are already up and running and they have what they need, and that's common practice across the organization. Obviously, a lot of teams are scrambling to figure out how they do this. And there's great tools out there, but the team needs to figure out what they need and how to use it and get it into place if they can. If they can't, they've got to go to a plan B and figure out what they are able to do with the tools that they have. Collaboration as another sort of type of engagement when it comes to design, innovation, problem solving, creativity. How do you sustain that in this type of environment? Again, it's all about the tools. If you have the tools and they work and everybody has access, you can do great stuff. If you don't, you're going to be very limited in what you can carry out and by what means. And then third, just straight up communication. How do you reach out to the all hands? How do you keep the sub-teams connected? What's the best tool for those one-on-one conversations that you want to sustain and with the various stakeholders? The video conferencing, phone conferencing, the difference between the online meetings where everybody's participating versus the giant webinar where you have thousands of people who have access, but you don't need to have everybody's face on the screen. Understanding the different tools that are available can enable you to get access to the right ones, make sure everybody has them and knows how to use them, and then you can really get going and get focused and get into action. That second question, does everyone have access to the tools and do they know how to use them? A really important distinction that I want to make is the difference between I'm too lazy to figure out how to use the tool versus I literally don't have access, right? So don't berate me and tell me to go watch a YouTube video. I don't have the bandwidth or I don't have the background or the training to understand how to get this on and up to speed on my own. And so that distinction is going to come up over and over in organizations where you have, in some organizations, a very wide variance within the same organization in the access that various stakeholders have. And so that's an important point to, I think, for leaders to remember, that some people are going to need a more gentle approach to still push and encourage, but with care to help them gain access if they can and understand how to use the tools, versus the kick in the butt approach to say, hey folks, I expect you to be on this call and I expect you to understand fully how to use this resource. You watch some YouTubes, let's go, let's get the training and let's get up to speed. So making sure that a leader is, as a leader, you're using the appropriate tone and appropriate approach to get everybody on board. And then finally, the specific processes and protocols to ensure consistency, right? The devil's in the details. And so we have the tool, everybody's got it, and we start using it, and there's one small problem. Miriam's putting the files in one folder, and Ema's putting them somewhere else. Meanwhile, Bob is scrambling around searching in a different folder to try to find them, while Ed is naming them something else, and so when I search for it, I can't find it. And now we have chaos. So it's amazing how many times those little last pieces of detail become so important to make sure, are we all using the same nomenclature? Are we all using the same structure, hierarchy for filing? Are we all putting the resources in the right place so that the other stakeholders involved can find those and build on them and utilize them? Reactions to any of that across that on page 5 when it comes to the tools. Ideas, thoughts, what have you seen work? What have you seen not work? Anything along those lines?
To your point, the devil's in the details is so key, especially even with naming conventions. It just feels like you need just tighter frameworks and directions and management at times like these, either beforehand when it goes into planning for these types of situations or during to get you there. So it might take some failing and then coming up with a new process and then making sure people are adhering to it. But it takes I think, an extra management effort to make sure that happens.
Yep.
What I like about what I'm seeing, John, is that if we just had the questions that are highlighted and not the notes underneath it, it's like we have the cheat sheet and just let the team come up with the answer. I think it could be very informative to us of what's needed, because you'll have different things brought up that we have not discussed and we haven't thought about yet.
Yeah.
So I really like this as a leadership crib sheet tool.
It's almost like actually using it to sort of survey the team. I think that would be a really good idea. I didn't even think of that. That would be a nice. I also see the idea of, I guess, redundancy happen a lot. So if one method doesn't work, then maybe this sheet could pull out other information from the team to say, well, maybe these are some backup plans. And then that way everyone's sort of thinking on the same page, number one, and number two, that you have maybe 4 or 5 options in case that first option doesn't work.
I've worked with several organizations. It's funny now that you mention it. I've worked with several organizations in the past where I have heard some of the team members propose and advocate for different collaborative tools, different project management tools, but because they were the early adopters, the majority of team members weren't familiar with them, didn't really understand the particular value of those tools, and so they sort of ebbed back into, well, we'll communicate by email, and we'll use some spreadsheets, and we'll distribute, Word documents attached to the emails, because that's what everybody knew, and that's what everybody was already using. Well, now fast forward to today, and all of a sudden those same teams have to get up to speed on more sophisticated tools because they just can't keep up with the pace using those old methods. They can try, right? But they're going to get overwhelmed. And so identifying the right tool, making sure folks have access, challenging them and expecting them to get up to speed so that the team can function at a very high performance level and not get overwhelmed by all the disruption. So as we've gone through these 3 keys, you can see how they relate to one another and have an impact on each other. If you're not clear on mission and priorities, you're going to be communicating the wrong information to the wrong people. And if you don't have the tools you need, you're not going to be able to execute even if you do have the right priorities identified. You're going to have to reiterate this process each time there's a major change in your context. That's okay. Don't worry about it. You'll get better at it each time you go through the process. If you're stuck or you have any questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website. I will try to answer as many questions as I possibly can. And of course, I'd be happy to work with you to guide you through the process if that would be of value to you. Well, be healthy, stay well, keep being generous with others, and let's keep working together to make the world a better place.